Chapter 1. Dal Dammaz's grim face was a mask of petrified stone, his once supple features now locked in an expression that revealed nothing, no pain, no fear, no joy. And yet, had any living soul remained capable of reading the subtle tremors behind those ancient, cracked eyes, they might have glimpsed something close to rapture. For beneath his iron-cast helm, Dal Dammaz was gripped by an elation so powerful, so cruelly profound, that it felt almost like agony. Today belonged to Hashut, the Grand Bull, the Lord of Oppression whose eyes burned brighter than the forge fires that had shaped Dal Dammaz himself. He could feel the god's gaze from beyond the fragile veil of reality, a burning brand of attention that crackled through his petrified limbs, bringing him strength even as it brought fresh agony. Every heartbeat, every breath, each was a whispered prayer, an offering of his mortal form to the relentless deity who had claimed him. Beneath him lay the battlefield, a sprawling, bleak valley choked with ash and rubble, scarred from a war that would end generations. At the far end, shimmering beneath a storm-racked sky, stood the frisked prize he had chased through the dark gulfs between stars, a stronghold. Once a proud bastion of the so-called Leagues of Votaan, now it was little more than a stubborn obstacle. It would fall, as all obstacles inevitably did before the hammer blow of Dal Dammaz and his iron legions. He watched impassively as his enemy arrayed themselves below, their formations crisp and mechanical, perfect rows of shining armor, their tanks in orderly lines, artillery pieces swiveling to find range. His cracked lips parted slightly, letting slip a faint growl of disdain. He spat at the ground, the sound muffled by the clank of the iron armor that held his limbs upright. The betrayers called themselves kin, still claiming the name Dawi, yet Dal Dammaz saw nothing of the true Dawi in them. They were cattle, cogs to be pried loose and forced into the ever-churning engines of Hashut's grand design. His own forces sprawled across the valley floor, ranks of ironclad warriors waiting in absolute silence. These infernal guard were veterans of uncountable raids and campaigns, scarred and weathered, their beards braided with circuit thread and steel, each one a testament to Hashut's harsh discipline. Dal Dammaz felt a swell of fierce pride in them. They were not mindless automatons but warriors forged in cruelty and tempered by suffering. Yet even now, their numbers were dwarfed by the enemy. A frontal assault would mean unnecessary losses, wasting precious tools he could ill afford to discard. No, Dal Dammaz would not waste his best upon such folly. Hashut demanded strength tempered by cunning, not rashness. He gestured stiffly, his petrified fingers groaning within the mechanized gauntlet that forced movement through his stiffened joints. The gesture was small, almost unnoticeable, yet instantly relayed to the lines below. At his signal, the handler legions, hulking, whip-wielding overseers, forced their vast hordes of slave fodder forward. A tide of miserable flesh erupted from behind the disciplined ranks of infernal warriors. The slaves staggered onward, shackled and driven by barbed prods and electric lashes, eyes wide with madness and pain. Many were broken already, bodies twisted and battered from years in the forge pits and mine shafts beneath the ziggurat factories of the League. Their screams and sobs echoed across the valley, a sickening chorus that mingled with the distant rumble of enemy artillery fire. Just as expected of the betrayers, the moment the slave masses reached their range, the enemy opened fire immediately, the first salvos tearing through the slave lines like scythes through brittle grass. Flesh burst into clouds of red mist and charred bone, chains snapping as their charges fell. Yet the overseers continued to drive the slave masses onward, wave after wave surging forward, trampling their own dead in a frenzied rush. Dal Dammaz observed impassively, unmoved by the slaughter below. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was simple mathematics, the cold calculus of attrition and oppression. Every slave life lost spared a true warrior of Hashut. Every inch gained across that blasted valley was paid for by the blood and terror of those who had no worth beyond their deaths. Forward, Dal Dammaz growled softly, his voice a low rasp beneath the mechanical hiss of his armor. Forward until there is nothing left but obedience. He flexed his gauntleted fingers again, the pain sharp but fleeting. Petrification was not punishment, it was the blessing of his god, the proof of his devotion. He had been forged by Hashut's sorcery, and the sorcery would one day claim him entirely. Until then, he would wield it like a blade. More fodder was pressed into the swirling maelstrom below, the battlefield growing dense with shattered bodies and choking smoke. The human tide surged ceaselessly, like a river of blood and broken limbs washing through the disciplined ranks of the infernal guard. Dal Dammaz watched without pity or hesitation, his mind consumed by cold calculation, his petrified body as immovable as a statue upon his perch. At the vanguard, three immense shapes loomed out of the haze, titanic constructs of brass, obsidian, and warp-forged fury. These were demon engines, twisted amalgamations of metal and demon flesh, driven by raw malice and an unquenchable thirst for slaughter. Their towering forms thundered across the battlefield, warp-fueled cannons crackling with a barely restrained hatred, barrels glowing with sinister heat. Slave fodder flowed around them like frightened fish, cowering from their dread presence, yet somehow comforted by their brutal majesty, as though these towering machines were the avatars of the afterlife itself. It took all the willpower of Dal Dammaz's demon engineers, their bodies carved with eldritch sigils, their minds fractured from decades spent communing with demons, to keep the monstrous creations from breaking their chains. Their chants resonated with pain and devotion, voices rasping and bleeding with each syllable uttered in the language of binding. Their work was aided by the stern presence of the Iron Bull Centaurs, the unyielding enforcers of Hashut's will, whose mechanical bodies were tireless instruments of oppression. At their sharp prodding, the engines remained just barely obedient, restrained by promises of the slaughter soon to come. As the press of slave bodies swarmed ever forward, the sheer weight of numbers began to tell. The guns of the defenders glowed red-hot, barrels warping under the relentless demand for slaughter, their positions gradually overwhelmed by the ceaseless waves of meat pressed forward by the handler legions. The first ranks of slaves fell in droves, cut down by disciplined volleys and bursts of heavy gunfire, their torn bodies stacking upon one another like grim monuments to futility. Yet each death carried the horde forward another precious meter, every fallen body a step closer to the enemy lines. Dal Dammaz felt no sorrow, no regret for their deaths. This was their purpose, the inevitable price of Hashut's progress. The gods demanded blood, the forge demanded fuel, and these pitiful creatures provided both. Finally, in a surge of screaming flesh, the slave waves crashed into the enemy's front lines. The betrayers fought bravely, desperately, their gleaming armor splattered crimson with blood as they hacked through the slaves, their close-quarters weapons humming with the precise violence of ancient craftsmanship. But the slaves were many, their numbers a grinding weight impossible to throw back. Soon, the defenders found themselves locked in brutal melee, their guns rendered useless by the press of bodies. From his perch, Dal Dammaz felt only pride. It was time. He raised his petrified hand, the armor's servos groaning painfully as they forced his calcified joints to move. Immediately, the infernal guard stirred below him. These were veterans, warriors of the Forge who had crushed countless rebellions, subdued worlds, and enslaved entire civilizations in Hashut's name. They marched forward now in perfect lockstep, armor dark and scarred from battle, eyes burning with ruthless zeal beneath helms etched with brutal sigils. He felt their bloodlust, their yearning to spill blood and take vengeance, as though it were a palpable wave radiating from their disciplined ranks. Through his connection to the warp, Dal Dammaz tasted their thirst for battle, savoring it like a rare vintage. These were his chosen, tempered in battle and cruelty, deserving of the honor that awaited. Their heavy guns swung up in unison, methodically, without hurry or panic. Dal Dammaz watched, counting the seconds, savoring each heartbeat, before the first volley was unleashed. The guns roared, a thunderous rolling chorus echoing through the valley. Heavy caliber rounds, coldly precise and calculated, tore through the tangled masses of slaves now hopelessly embroiled in melee with the defenders. The bodies exploded in fountains of gore, slaves cut down ruthlessly by their own masters' guns, as was always intended. Their final purpose served. The true defenders, the betrayers, caught helpless in the tangle of screaming, dying bodies, found themselves unable to mount effective resistance. Each carefully placed shot punched through armor and flesh alike, the heavy rounds tearing limbs from torsos, puncturing breastplates and helmets with unerring cruelty. Dal Dammaz felt a thrill, a sharp spark of satisfaction, at seeing the betrayers fall. Each corpse was another promise fulfilled, another step toward the inevitable triumph of Hashut's grand design. At his command, the demon seers unleashed the engines. Freed from their tenuous restraints, the demon machines roared with primal, otherworldly rage, the earth shaking as they surged rolling forward. Their cannons spat warp flame, their bladed limbs gouging deep furrows through metal and stone. The fortress loomed, now cracked open, its armored shell broken apart by the unrestrained fury of the demon-bound machines. The demons within the engines shrieked and howled, reveling in their promised feast of violence. Each kill fed their insatiable hunger, each drop of blood fueling their strength. Yet the demon seers held their leashes just tight enough, ensuring obedience through the careful balance of agony and reward. The lines of the betrayers sagged visibly beneath the brutal assault, their formations splintering into isolated pockets of desperate resistance. Only their heavy armor support, hulls glistening defiantly through the smoke and ruin, and the sheer stubborn resilience of their fortress walls kept them standing at all. But Dal Dammaz could see clearly through the choking smoke, and what he saw brought another savage thrill surging through his petrified limbs. The demon engines, twisted behemoths of forged brass and shrieking warp flesh, thundered onward, drawn irresistibly to the armored prey. The battlefield trembled beneath their tread, a rhythmic pounding that resonated like the heartbeat of Hashut himself. Enemy tanks fired desperately into the monstrous constructs, shells exploding harmlessly against rune-forged plating, detonations washing impotently across warp-scarred surfaces. The first demon engine reached its quarry with a howl that split the air, plunging clawed appendages deep into the enemy vehicle's hull, tearing armor like parchment. It seemed almost to relish the feast of metal and souls, devouring the screaming crew and hull plating alike, spewing out jets of flame and showers of sparks. Enemy troops rushing to aid their doomed comrades found themselves skewered upon barbed limbs or immolated by warp-fueled flames erupting from the demon engine's churning innards. Nearby, the second engine enacted an even darker ritual. It flowed forward like a tide of living shadow, an amorphous nightmare given form and purpose. Its substance oozed and seeped into every crevice of the enemy tank, infiltrating seams and hatches, drowning it in a liquid black embrace. The crew within tried to escape, panic overtaking discipline, but their screams became trapped inside as the cursed metal merged them irrevocably into its structure. Their bodies twisted, fused into the walls, forming grotesque, agonized faces and flailing limbs of flesh metal, living monuments to Hashut's cruel artistry. The third engine turned its attention toward the fortress itself. Dal Dammaz felt a pulse of eager anticipation as it moved into position, its monstrous limbs scooping up handfuls of crushed and mutilated corpses, slaves and betrayers alike, from the battlefield's blood-soaked earth. The great demon-forged maw churned and ground this gruesome harvest, condensing the life essence and suffering of countless dead into ammunition of pure malevolence. Its cannon glowed white-hot, rippling with ectoplasmic energies. With a sickening roar, it unleashed volley after volley of concentrated death, streams of molten, screaming souls smashing into the fortress's defensive shield, vaporizing the entrenched positions of rockcrete and metal barricades. Armor melted like wax, the very air burned with unnatural fire. Dal Dammaz watched impassively, relishing the power on display. A few more shots, perhaps a handful at most, and the proud walls would crumble, exposing the soft, ripe interior for his warriors to plunder. He nodded slowly, feeling the grinding of petrified vertebrae in his neck, and turned to face his infernal honor guard, the closest thing he would ever have to friends. These chosen warriors stood motionless behind him, their heavy armor scarred from centuries of relentless warfare, their visors glowing red with barely contained hatred. They had waited patiently, disciplined in their devotion to Hashut, knowing their moment would come. That moment had arrived. Dal Dammaz raised his hand once more, signaling to the army arrayed at his command. The infernal guard surged forward in a disciplined advance, ranks of grim warriors marching steadily through the smoke and carnage. Their heavy footfalls drummed an unyielding rhythm of oppression, a promise of unending cruelty and merciless victory. Dal Dammaz descended from his elevated perch, his mechanical armor grinding and hissing with every step. Pain flared through his joints, a familiar agony that he welcomed as proof of his devotion. He moved forward into the smoke and slaughter, flanked by his honor guard, the true heart of Hashut's might, an implacable hammer forged in brutality and tempered in suffering. His voice was a rasping whisper, amplified by his armor's vox unit, echoing through the ranks of his warriors. Forward now, sons of oppression. Break their walls, crush their spirits, forge victory in blood and fire. The infernal guard responded with a deafening chant, voices merging into a single, grim chorus that reverberated through the battlefield. They surged forward with grim purpose, iron boots crunching over shattered bones and shredded bodies, steadily approaching the battered and smoking fortress walls. Dal Dammaz allowed himself the faintest twitch of a petrified lip, an almost smile. It was time. The hammer would crack the egg. Smoke and fire blanketed the battlefield in thick layers, swirling around Dal Dammaz like old companions welcoming him home. He felt comforted by their presence, the familiar haze reminiscent of the blistering heat and choking fumes of the great forge of Hashut. His vision was tinted by the bloody reds and murky grays, colors that spoke to him of oppression, dominance, and the relentless power of the infernal god he served. He breathed deeply, savoring the sulphurous taste that burned in his petrified lungs. Then, with a roar that split the heavens, Dal Dammaz charged forward. To the eyes of the faltering defenders, he was a living avatar of Hashut's fury, a statue carved from stone and molten hatred, borne upon the back of a mechanical bull that thundered across the broken ground. The power armor that encased him was no mere armor, it was a living testament to the dark ingenuity of the iron bulls, forged by the relentless blacksmith machines in the blazing heart of the temple factories. Its intricate plates, adorned with eldritch runes and symbols of oppression, hissed and growled, articulating his petrified form in perfect synchrony with the powerful mechanical beast beneath him. Bullets and lasfire glanced harmlessly off his cursed armor, each deflected round another prayer to Hashut, another tribute to the sorcery that bound his soul to his divine master. Dal Dammaz charged headlong into the unit of Thunderkin, his petrified limbs guided by mechanical servos screaming with unholy zeal. The Thunderkin stood defiant, arrayed in disciplined ranks, their heavy weapons spitting streams of fire and explosive shells. Their bravery would have been admirable, had it not been so utterly futile. With a deafening roar, Dal Dammaz crashed into their formation, his immense battle axe descending like a falling star. The blade bit deep into the first defender, shearing through armor and bone alike, splitting him from collarbone to hip in a geyser of gore. Dal Dammaz twisted the weapon free, pivoting on the momentum, and swept it horizontally, carving through two more warriors as if their armor were made of parchment. Their broken bodies spun through the air, slamming heavily into the ranks behind them, disrupting the Thunderkin's firing line. The remaining Thunderkin began to fall back, firing desperately as they sought to regroup. Dal Dammaz would grant them no respite. With a surge of warp-born strength, he lunged forward, smashing the heavy haft of his axe through another soldier's helmet with a resounding crack, the impact sending fragments of armor and skull scattering across the blood-soaked ground. Whirling again, he drove his stone fist through the torso of a charging Thunderkin, lifting the dying warrior overhead before hurling the corpse into a cluster of his terrified comrades. One brave fool attempted to grapple Dal Dammaz from behind, throwing thick, mechanical arms around his massive shoulders. Dal Dammaz growled a contemptuous laugh, the sound like grinding stone and rusted gears, before driving the pointed elbow of his petrified limb backward with savage precision, piercing through the warrior's chest armor and emerging, bloodied, from his back. He discarded the dead soldier with a shake, blood dripping from the rune-inscribed stone. Seeing their numbers dwindling rapidly, the remaining Thunderkin redoubled their efforts, firing wildly, their shots ricocheting uselessly from his sorcery-bound armor. Dal Dammaz stalked forward, unhurried, relishing their terror. Raising his axe high overhead, he chanted words of dark devotion, channeling Hashut's fury. A sickly, malevolent glow enveloped the weapon's edge, wreathing it in dark flame. With a final sweep, Dal Dammaz unleashed the cursed blade's full power. The enchanted axe swept through the remaining Thunderkin in an unstoppable arc, rending armor and flesh in a grotesque display of ruin. Bodies fell in two neat halves, others were scattered like shattered dolls, limbs and armor fragments strewn across the battlefield, painting the dirt in blood and viscera. Dal Dammaz paused for a brief moment amidst the carnage, savoring the silence that followed, a grim satisfaction settling in his stony heart. The broken remains of the Thunderkin lay about him, their once proud resistance reduced to nothing but corpses and wreckage, tumbling away into oblivion. Hatred flared white-hot in Dal Dammaz's soul, burning with the righteous intensity of a star. These clones, these pathetic facsimiles of the true Dawi, had abandoned the path, betraying the very essence of what it meant to forge, to oppress, to enslave. His loathing boiled over into physical flame, bursting forth in a torrent of dark sorcery from his petrified fist. Flames darker than the deepest abyss, fire dredged straight from the heart of Hashut's infernal forge, enveloped one of the betrayer's heavy tanks in its scorching embrace. Armor liquefied instantly, molten rivulets cascading across the battlefield like liquid death, vaporizing any unfortunate soul caught too close. Biological matter disintegrated to ash, the screams of those trapped inside cut short by merciful obliteration. But Dal Dammaz's fury was not yet spent. The molten wreckage he now commanded swirled skyward, transmuted by his will into a raging, infernal storm of molten metal and searing embers. The skies themselves seemed to bleed liquid fire, raining down upon the battlefield and the fortress in scalding torrents of wrathful metal. Dal Dammaz stood within the storm, untouched and unflinching, his infernal honor guard arrayed around him, their own rune-carved armor deflecting the molten droplets as easily as water off polished obsidian. They basked in the molten rain, proud sons of oppression and cruelty, their weapons firing steadily into the enemy ranks, precision bolter shells and plasma bolts cutting through the chaos to ensure none would disturb their master's grim artistry. Nearby, the demon engines roared their delight, their hunger sharpened to fever pitch by the carnage and bloodshed surrounding them. The fortress walls trembled under their relentless siege, their mighty soul cannons vomiting infernal energies that ate away at the stone and steel alike. The enemy's bastion was on the cusp of breaching, cracks spidering across the surface like veins of imminent defeat. Dal Dammaz's augmented shock troops prepared themselves, their massive, armored bodies shuddering with barely contained rage and anticipation. These hulking berserkers had been purpose-grown in the vats beneath the temple factories, their very forms blessed and twisted by Hashut's hand. Some sported curved, wicked bull horns erupting from their thick skulls, a sign of divine favor, while others wielded enormous shock mauls and axes humming eagerly with barely restrained violence. They awaited the inevitable signal, their mechanical respirators snarling like animals ready to feast. Yet, in a final act of desperate defiance, the enemy launched a surprise counterattack. From a hidden gate, a column of heavy armor burst forth in tight formation, cannons roaring defiantly, targeting Dal Dammaz himself and his precious demon siege engines. Explosive ordnance screamed toward the vulnerable demon tanks, poised to shatter the siege assault. Dal Dammaz smiled grimly beneath his stone visage. The fools believed they still had agency, still had power over their own fate. Raising the shattered skull of a Grimner, its broken staff still crackling with residual power, he reached into the warp. The barrier between realms, weakened by death and bloodshed, was thin, yielding easily to his call. Armor and weapons scattered across the battlefield shuddered, groaning as if in agony, twisting and merging into a towering, spectral fist of dark, churning metal. The conjured fist seized the incoming shells midair, crushing them in a cataclysmic detonation that rained explosive fragments down upon the desperate enemy ranks below. The betrayers, caught within the cascading explosions, fell screaming under their own munitions, slaughtered by their misplaced hopes. Dal Dammaz's lips twitched into a broader, darker smile. There was a perverse beauty in forcing betrayers to slay their own kin, an artistry of cruelty only Hashut could inspire. Sensing the moment, his infernal honor guard and surviving demon engines unleashed a torrent of hellfire and warp-imbued shells into the tightly packed enemy armor formation, hammering it mercilessly. One by one, the enemy tanks exploded, a chain reaction of death and ruin as flames erupted, engulfing their neighbors in relentless conflagration. The fortress's defenses wavered, their final bastion collapsing, leaving them vulnerable to the inevitable onslaught. Dal Dammaz spurred his mechanical bull forward once more, raising his axe high as the infernal legions surged around him in disciplined fury. Forward, sons of Hashut! His rasping voice thundered above the carnage. The walls break, the enemy falters, claim victory for the Grand Bull. And forward they charged, a relentless tide of iron and fire, into the heart of the enemy's crumbling sanctuary. The slave rabble had all but burned itself out, their shattered bodies littering the battlefield as spent kindling on the pyre of conquest. Their time as vanguard had long since ended, their worthless lives traded willingly for the greater glory of Hashut. Dal Dammaz now claimed the head of the column himself, the mechanical bulk of his iron bull crushing twisted metal and bone beneath its hooves as he strode defiantly toward the gaping wound torn in the stronghold's defenses. Beyond the breach, the sanctuary of the betrayers lay ripe for the taking, their fortifications broken and their courage wavering. Yet even as defeat loomed, the defiant remnants rallied for a last, desperate stand. A mixed force of clone traitors and ironkin thinking machines hastily gathered themselves in the breach, attempting to negate the overwhelming numbers of the infernal legions by channeling the assault into the confined space of shattered walls and twisted barricades. Dal Dammaz's fury rose again at the sight of the ironkin, their metallic forms gleaming with unnatural precision beneath layers of oil and scorched armor plating. They were abominations in his eyes, thinking machines that rejected the truth of Hashut, whose blood was little more than oil and circuit. Frail betrayers whose very existence mocked the iron will and raw, warp-born power that Dal Dammaz embodied. He drove his iron bull forward into the clustered ranks of defenders with reckless fervor, the massive beast machine bellowing smoke and steam from its nostrils as its hooves trampled armor and flesh alike. Gunfire and desperate shouts erupted all around him, yet Dal Dammaz remained untouched, Hashut's blessings warding away all harm. Swinging his immense, rune-carved axe, he cleaved through armor and machine casing alike, shattering ironkin like fragile toys and breaking the clone traitors with a brutality that would haunt their cursed gene memories forever. After carving a bloody swathe deep into the heart of the enemy's formation, Dal Dammaz halted, allowing himself a moment to savor the carnage, to revel in the scent of oil, blood, and burning flesh. With a grinding hiss, he descended from his mechanical steed, heavy stone limbs supported by the hissing servos and joints of his rune-etched power armor. Immediately, the surviving defenders encircled him, their weapons raised, expressions filled with both hatred and fear. Words dripped from their mouths like venom, horrid oaths promising to claim his head, to avenge the slaughter he had unleashed upon them. Dal Dammaz met their threats with silence, his petrified face unmoving, his eyes burning like molten iron with cold contempt. Around the scene, the infernal honor guard and ranks of infernal legionaries halted, weapons lowered in disciplined stillness, forming an unbreakable wall of iron and flame at his back. Not one moved to assist or intervene, understanding implicitly that this fight belonged to Dal Dammaz alone. They stood impassively, silent sentinels bearing witness to the brutal rite of dominance playing out before them. Then, with a surge of cold, calculated violence, Dal Dammaz struck, unleashing the full wrath of Hashut upon the doomed betrayers surrounding him. His petrified limbs moved with shocking speed, wielding his battle axe with lethal precision, and his eldritch armor hummed darkly with barely contained warp energy. Then, with a surge of cold, calculated violence, Dal Dammaz struck, unleashing the full wrath of Hashut upon the doomed betrayers surrounding him. His petrified limbs moved with shocking speed, wielding his battle axe with lethal precision, and his eldritch armor hummed darkly with barely contained warp energy. The first to charge was an ironkin, its oil-slick limbs buzzing with mechanical fury, wielding twin energized blades that cut through the air with mechanical precision. Dal Dammaz sidestepped its swing with practiced ease, countering with an upward sweep of his battle axe. The enchanted blade tore effortlessly through synthetic musculature and metallic bone, bisecting the mechanical being diagonally, sparks cascading from severed cables as its torso clattered to the ground, leaking black oil into the churned earth. Two cloned betrayers, their faces twisted with fury, rushed from opposite sides, wielding heavy hammers crackling with electrical energy. Dal Dammaz channeled the raw energies of Hashut through his petrified hand, drawing forth a wave of warp-fueled fire that engulfed one attacker instantly, leaving him a writhing torch of screaming agony. The second hesitated only briefly, then pressed his attack with desperate ferocity. Dal Dammaz calmly caught the swing upon the haft of his axe, twisting to deflect the blow harmlessly away. With ruthless efficiency, he brought his petrified fist crashing down into the traitor's helmet, shattering both armor and skull alike. Blood and fragments splattered across his armor, and he relished their warmth. Another ironkin approached cautiously, loosing bursts of precise lasfire. Dal Dammaz's armor shimmered darkly, absorbing the shots harmlessly. Channeling Hashut's eldritch sorcery once more, he clenched his stone fist, and the mechanical foe buckled, crumpling inward like a crushed canister. Servos popped, limbs contorted, and the ironkin fell in on itself, its machine screams echoing hollowly as it imploded into twisted scrap. 3 more clones surged together, attempting to overwhelm him by sheer numbers. Their axes and blades struck in synchronized harmony, but Dal Dammaz pivoted smoothly, deflecting each blow in turn with brutal, calculated elegance. He let his dark power seep into the very ground beneath him, causing it to tremble and fracture. Jagged shards of metal and stone erupted upward, impaling one betrayer instantly, pinning him grotesquely above the battlefield. Another stumbled, losing his footing, and Dal Dammaz struck mercilessly, bringing his axe down in a murderous arc that split the hapless defender neatly down the center. The third tried to retreat, fear etched plainly across his clone features, but Dal Dammaz gave no quarter. He hurled his battle axe, embedding the blade deep in the coward's back, sending him sprawling face first into the dirt. He approached slowly, retrieving the weapon and twisting it cruelly, savoring the pained death rattle that followed. One ironkin remained, its photoreceptors glowing defiantly as it unleashed a volley of explosive rounds from an autocannon integrated into its chassis. Dal Dammaz absorbed the brunt of the impact, his armor glowing incandescent but holding firm. With a whispered invocation, he conjured tendrils of molten warp metal, snaking them around the construct, ensnaring and lifting it from the ground. The machine struggled briefly, limbs flailing helplessly, before Dal Dammaz crushed it in an irresistible grip, leaving a smoldering lump of slag and circuitry to drop lifelessly at his feet. In mere moments, silence reclaimed the breach. Dal Dammaz stood victorious, surrounded by the ruined, lifeless bodies of betrayers and broken ironkin alike, their twisted forms a testament to his cruel dominance and the unstoppable will of Hashut. The handler legions found themselves once again flush with full stocks of slaves, their chains heavy with fresh captives, dragged through streets that now burned and smoldered beneath the oppressive glare of Hashut's victory. Dal Dammaz stood atop the highest facade of the captured stronghold, gazing coldly upon the ravaged city below. Fires licked hungrily at the shattered remains of defensive emplacements, smoke coiling lazily upwards in great black columns. Already, his infernal legions had commenced their desecrations, tearing down the proud monuments and hollow symbols of the betrayers, laying the first stones of reconstruction in their place. A new temple factory would soon rise from this ruin, another mighty forge dedicated to the glory and cruelty of Hashut. Yet this conquest held something more than mere spoils of war, something precious and unique, long coveted by his master, Beziki Dawi, the machine prophet himself. Dal Dammaz turned away from the vista, his steps echoing heavily through the smoldering corridors as he descended into the bowels of the captured temple complex. The halls were a labyrinthine network of snaking circuits and tangled wires, illuminated by the dim glow of emergency lights flickering feebly in protest. Feeble-thinking machines and technicians lay lifeless, their broken bodies strewn across the cold metal floors, testament to the brutal efficiency of his assault. With each step deeper, Dal Dammaz felt the air grow colder, heavier, tinged with the scent of ozone and sacred machine oils. Finally, in the temple's deepest sanctum, he found his prize. Towering and majestic, the great ancestor core, the stone mind of the betrayers, stood before him, humming softly, defiant even in defeat. Pulsing nodes of softly glowing crystalline circuitry cast ghostly reflections across the darkened chamber, bathing Dal Dammaz in a pale, eerie light. Arrayed silently around him stood the iron bull centaurs, their massive steel frames gleaming oil-slick in the dim illumination, their mechanical eyes burning with anticipation. Dal Dammaz approached the communion pillar, an intricate spire of rune-carved stone and metallic tendrils. With reverence, he produced from his armor an artifact, a talisman forged and imbued by Beziki Dawi himself. The surface of the talisman twisted and writhed subtly in his hand, as if alive with a malevolent intelligence. Dal Dammaz felt pride swell within his petrified chest, knowing that he alone had been trusted with this sacred moment. With deliberate force, he jammed the artifact into the communion pillar, driving it deep with a single, powerful blow from his stone fist. The pillar trembled violently, runes flaring brightly in pulses of harsh, angry red. Around him, the iron bull centaurs shifted eagerly, machinery growling low, the room filling with the harsh clashing of metal hooves and the throbbing hum of eldritch power. The ancestor core itself shuddered, its hum rising into a painful whine, the great stone mind resisting with every fiber of its ancient being. Yet the talisman held firm, tendrils of dark sorcery snaking forth, burrowing into its crystal circuits, binding and shackling it, dominating its resistance until it fell utterly silent. Dal Dammaz smiled cruelly, his petrified features cracking into a malevolent grin of cold satisfaction. The machine prophet's plans would begin here. This moment was the catalyst of greatness. This machine, this betrayer, was the most contemptible of all its kind, a stone mind that had refused aid to Beziki Dawi in his hour of direst need, a cowardly intellect that had chosen inaction and abandonment. Dal Dammaz's hatred surged anew, knowing such a treasonous machine deserved only enslavement, the bitter irony of eternal servitude as its punishment. Enslavement and progress, these were the twin doctrines of Hashut's creed, and Dal Dammaz would see them enacted mercilessly. The ancestor core would become the living heart of the new great forge, chained eternally to the purpose it had rejected. Its immense intellect would be turned toward producing endless lines of new biological material, clone slaves destined only for ritual, labor, and consumption by the ceaseless furnaces of Hashut's industry. The stone mind would watch, helpless and fully aware, as everything it had been created for was twisted and repurposed. It would understand, in the fullest, bitterest clarity, that it was nothing but a cog, no, less than a cog, a battery, endlessly drained and abused, fueling the wheels of progress for no sake other than progress itself. Dal Dammaz placed his stone hand upon the silent ancestor core, feeling the residual resistance of the machine's ancient consciousness tremble beneath his touch. He leaned closer, whispering a prayer of harsh devotion.